Episode 6, Part 01, Chapter 06. Chapter 6. It was the gentle buzzing of the TV screen down in Avalanche's secret hideout that woke Cloud the next morning. As Cloud opened his eyes and slowly sat up, his back ached from the uncomfortable sleep he had had after sleeping on the floor. Barrett may have agreed to let him take part in the next mission, but that didn't mean that Cloud was going to get first-class treatment. It looked as though the other Avalanche members were already away, for the room was empty and stripped of anything that would incriminate them if the room were discovered. All of Jesse's technological bits and bobs had been hidden away, and the room looked as though it were simply a storage room converted into a living room. The first thing Cloud did as he got up was to head over to the pinball machine, lift and head up to the main part of the bar. Tifa and Barrett were waiting for him there. Tifa was busy doing some cleaning in the bar while Barrett tapped his foot impatiently, cursing silently to himself that he had let Cloud stay in the same building as him. Marlene was also hard at work, doing some more cleaning behind the bar itself. As Cloud stepped off the lift, Tifa stopped working and smiled, a smile filled with the joy and life of a new day. "Good morning, Cloud," she greeted, sounding surprisingly cheerful. "Did you sleep well?" Cloud pulled a face and made a sideward glance at Barrett. "Barrett's snoring kept me up," he complained. Tifa immediately put a finger to her mouth to silence him, and whispered to him sharply. "Keep it down, they'll hear you. Barrett's always edgy before an operation." She then lightened her expression and smiled once more. "I'm going this time." Cloud tilted his head and looked at Tifa, awaiting an explanation. Tifa had never been on an Avalanche mission, even though she was a member of Avalanche herself. However, the girl didn't give an explanation and instead turned to Barrett, who by now was becoming even more impatient than he was before. "Our target's the Sector 5 reactor," Barrett explained to them both as they looked at him awaiting the mission details. "Head for the station first. I'll fill you in on the train." He suddenly stopped and looked at Cloud. "Yo, Cloud. Before the next mission, I got something I wanna ask you. I don't really know how to use materia. I'll give you that materia you found. Just teach me how to use it." Cloud sighed heavily and folded his arms. "You wouldn't understand," he answered simply. Barrett's eyes immediately flared in anger. "So this is what makes all them guys and soldiers so great, hey?" he demanded. "Okay. I'll ask Jesse again later. But you're in charge of the materia." He pulled the small green ball of materia they had found at the Sector 1 reactor and threw it to Cloud, who caught it easily and looked into its shimmering green surface. He couldn't tell for sure, but from the shimmer inside of the ball it looked like a form of curative materia. He looked at it for a second longer before passing it to Tifa, whom he felt would make better use of it. Tifa took the ball and placed it into a materia slot on the armlets of her fighting gloves. As the ball became locked in the slot, it glowed a little, its power spreading through Tifa's gloves. When she was done, Tifa turned to Marlene. "Marlene, you watch the store while we're gone," she told the young girl. Marlene looked up from the stool she was stood on to clean the counter. "All right," she said as her father, Tifa, and Cloud headed out of the bar. "Good luck." The slums looked exactly the same as they did at midnight, and it would have been impossible to tell that it was morning without any clocks to tell the time. The usual crowd were out and about, hanging around near the exit of the slums to watch as Barrett and his team headed out towards the train station. Some of the younger kids giggled as Cloud and Tifa walked past, for they had been spying on their conversation during the night. Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse were waiting for the three on the station platform to keep the train from leaving. As they saw their leader approach, they jumped up and hurried into the train, followed closely by Barrett, Tifa, and Cloud. As the last of the passengers piled onto the train, the station guard looked around to make sure that there were no last-minute passengers. When he was confident that the coast was clear, he raised his arm and blew his whistle hard. Inside the train, Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge were all piled into a single train car, sitting comfortably amongst the rest of the passengers in the car. Not surprisingly, it was the same group of people who had been on the train home during the night, the homeless guy, the man reading the newspaper, and the man in the red suit, who was still holding onto the rails and looking sick. "Yo!" came Barrett's angry voice. All at once the three members of Avalanche jumped up out of their seats and turned sharply to Barrett as he walked into the car, with Tifa and Cloud behind him. Barrett's face was fuming as he saw his three comrades grouped together in a single car, which looked much more suspicious. "Looks like this ain't no private car," Barrett observed. "So split up." Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge did as they were told and immediately split up, heading through the doors to the adjoining cars where they would split up and not be spotted together as a group. As they left, the man in the suit let go of the rails and sighed heavily. Hoodlums again, he mumbled to himself. God, don't I just have all the luck? As he walked away from the rails and sat himself firmly down in one of the train seats, Barrett ran up past him towards the door and looked out, trying to see who had just spoken. You say something? He growled angrily, looking around at the next car. He got no reply, so he raised his voice a little. I said, you say something? Again there was no answer. Realizing this, Barrett turned and walked back to the seats. He stopped directly beside the suited man and grabbed hold of the rail, looking down at him. Yo, look at that. It got empty all of a sudden. What's going on? Slowly the suited man looked up at Barrett, and sweat began to pour down his face. Damn! He cursed loudly, realizing he had been caught. His voice began to stammer nervously. It's empty because of... Gee, guys like you. It was the wrong thing to say. Barrett snarled angrily and hit the man hard on the head with his fist. The man shrunk back in his seat in fear, but did not move out of the way. Why, yipes! He said. You've seen the news, right? Avalanche says there'll be more bombings. Only devoted employees like me would go to Midgar on a day like today. That was enough for Barrett. Upon hearing those words, he immediately stepped back and raised his gun, aiming at the man and preparing to fire if provoked. You workin' for Shinra? He demanded. The Shinra manager's body quivered in absolute terror. He quickly ducked his head down and curled himself into a ball, his arms above his head to protect himself. Loud sobs began to echo from his curled-up form, filled with fear and anxiety. I won't give in to violence. He sobbed pitifully. And I'm not giving you my seat either. Barrett raised his fist once more as he prepared to hit the manager again, but Tifa ran up to him quickly and grabbed his arm. Barrett! She shouted at him. Barrett looked at Tifa, before lowering his arm and turning to the Shinra manager. Fuck! You lucky son of a bitch! He cursed, and stormed off to the other end of the car where Cloud was standing. Tifa sighed heavily before following him and leaving the weeping manager. So, what are we gonna do now? Cloud asked now that the drama was over with. Shit! Barrett said in frustration, waving his arms around. The hell you so calm about? You bustin' up my rhythm. At that moment a loud whistle could be heard, and the car suddenly shook from side to side. Seems like they just finished connecting the cars, Tifa observed. We're finally leaving. As she spoke, the train shook again as it choked into life and began to move slowly across the brown and rusty rails, beginning its long and tiresome journey around the city of Midgar. The train moved slowly at first before it began to pick up some speed, until it was moving fairly rapidly away from Sector 7 and into the rest of Midgar. So what's our next target? Cloud asked once more, getting back to the subject of the mission. Ha! Listen to Mr. Serious about his work. Barrett taunted mockingly, and Tifa rolled her eyes. Seeing the unimpressed looks both she and Cloud were giving him, Barrett crossed his arms. Alright. I'll tell you. Jesse's probably already told you, but there's a security checkpoint at the top plate. It's an ID scan system check in all the trains. Which Shinra is very proud of, Tifa added. Barrett nodded. We can't use our fake IDs anymore. He stopped as the speaker above them crackled into life, and the computerized voice spoke blankly to them. Good morning, and welcome to Midgar Lines. Arrival time at Sector 4 station will be 11:45. That means we've only got 3 more minutes until the ID checkpoint, Tifa told Barrett, who nodded in agreement. He turned to the two of them and clenched his one good fist. All right, he said confidently. In 3 minutes, we're jumping off this train. Got it. And with that, Barrett walked briskly away from Tifa and Cloud and sat himself down firmly on the couch near to the Shinra manager, who began to shiver once more as the large avalanche leader sat extremely close to him. Luckily Barrett had his mind on other things and simply ignored the manager, keeping himself focused on the mission ahead. Tifa, on the other hand, had walked past Barrett and had stopped at the other end of the car, right beside the railway map computer that Jesse had shown to Cloud just yesterday. Tifa turned to Cloud and waved excitedly to grab his attention. Cloud, come over here. She called cheerfully. Let's look at the railway map monitor. Sighing, Cloud walked slowly over to Tifa and stood a few good inches behind her, looking over the young woman's shoulder at the screen, not looking particularly interested. Tifa noticed this, and as she turned she had a huge smile on her face as she giggled at him. It looks like you've seen this already, she observed, once her giggling had subsided. It's all right. Come a little closer. She giggled again as Cloud shrugged dismissively. Then he took a single step closer to Tifa, and continued to watch the computer screen as the railway map came up. It was almost exactly the same as the one Jessie had shown him, although it was slightly different now. They were moving away from Sector 7 and towards Sector 4, their new destination. Neither of the two said anything as they watched the map roll by. Cloud was still puzzled by Tifa's sudden decision to come along on this particular mission, and she still hadn't explained why she had changed her mind. He didn't get the chance to ask her however, for at that very moment a red light suddenly flashed within the car they were in, followed by the beeping of the signal that meant the ID check was in progress. Tifa looked up in surprise. That's odd, she said, bewildered. The ID checkpoint was supposed to be further down. Moments later the beeping of the signal stopped. Just a second later the alarm went off, a loud, whirring siren that pierced the ears of the people in the car and made them jump in surprise. Barrett leaped out of his chair and looked up as the speaker crackled once more, and the computerized voice spoke with a harsh and serious tone. Type A security alert. Unidentified passengers confirmed. A search of all cars will be executed. Repeat. Type A security alert. Unidentified passengers confirmed. A search of all cars will be executed. What's happening? Asked Tifa. Barrett ran up to her. What's going on? He demanded, just as confused as she was. The door to the car opened as Jessie ran in, her face pale with fear as she realized that somehow they had been caught out as unidentified passengers on the train. We're in trouble, she told them, stating the obvious. I'll explain later. Hurry. Get to the next car. Fuck. Barrett cursed. He shook his fist angrily, while Cloud folded his arms and thought. Someone blew it. Unidentified passengers located in car number 1. Preparing for lockdown. Barrett turned to his colleagues. Let's go. Keep it up, he ordered. Jessie turned and ran out of the door, followed closely by Barrett, Tifa, and Cloud. Just as they passed through into the next car, the door slid shut automatically, and a loud click signaled the door being locked and sealed behind them. Car number 1 locked down. Upgrading to level 2 warning. Barrett looked around the next car. The other inhabitants of the car were all sitting fearfully in their seats, wishing that the alarms would go off and their journey return to normal. Jessie was stood further down the car with Biggs and Wedge, who were also looking around fearfully for any sign of guards that could come looking for them. Hurry! Biggs urged them. They're gonna lock the door, sir, Wedge said. He and Biggs both turned and ran through the door into the third car, just as the speaker spoke up once again over the sound of the raging alarm. Unidentified passengers located in car number 2. Preparing for lockdown. Just run, Jessie advised Barrett and the others, before she followed the lead of Biggs and Wedge and ran down towards the next car. Barrett, Cloud, and Tifa were not close behind, for they did not want to get locked in the car and be caught by the Shinra. Again, they only made it out of the car just in time. Cloud was only halfway through the door before it began to close on him, and he had to move quickly before getting trapped in the door. Car number 2 locked down. Upgrading to warning level 3. As the door slammed shut and locked itself, the alarm fell silent, and the lights in the car returned to normal. It looked as though they had outrun the train security, and Barrett seemed extremely pleased about it. Alright. We clear? He asked Jessie. Unfortunately, Jessie shook her head. Not yet, she confirmed. They're starting another check. If we're caught, we're done for. But, don't worry. If we move up the train, car by car, we should get past it. She then turned and ran down towards the end of the car, to where a man had stopped in front of the door leading into the fourth car. Furiously Jessie lashed out, punching the man extremely hard in his stomach. The man crumpled and fell instantly at the force of her punch and quickly crawled out of the way of the door, leaving Jessie to run through to the next car. The moment she disappeared, the alarms and lights went off again, and once again everyone in the car jumped back in fright.
Unidentified passengers, moving to front of train. Currently tracking location.
Barrett signaled to Tifa and Cloud, and ran on towards the next car. Tifa and Cloud followed close behind, running as fast as they could towards the last car. From now on they didn't stop as they moved on, and just continued to run past the terrified passengers before they could be caught.
Car number 3 locked down. Upgrading to warning level 4.
They continued to run on, regardless of the warnings, and into the last car.
Car number 4 locked down. Upgrading to maximum security alert.
Now in the very last car of the train, Barrett stopped and looked around desperately in search of Jessie and the other Avalanche members. He found them fairly quickly, but they had disguised themselves to avoid looking suspicious. Wedge was near the entrance, dressed in a dungarees and T-shirt. Biggs was close by, wearing a smart tuxedo suit and hat, with a fake mustache under his nose to hide the rest of his face. Jessie was standing near the front of the train by the car exit, clad in a full red Shinra guard uniform, which she had probably swiped from a guard who had tried to stop her. Barrett ran down towards her, and turned back to the others.
All right. We made it. Yo. This way.
He called out to Cloud and Tifa. As Cloud and Tifa darted down towards him, Jessie turned to the large door that led out of the car and opened it with a lever. As the door opened, a gust of cold air blew into the train, and the sound of the train traveling on the rail tracks became louder. Now, with both the alarm and the train sounds to deal with, Barrett had to shout really loud in order to be heard.
Let's go.
He yelled.
We're gonna dive out of here.
Tifa glanced out of the door, before she turned to Cloud with an almost excited smile on her face.
Scary? Hey. Too late to be saying that now,
Cloud told her. He tilted his head to the side.
Why'd you come along anyway?
Tifa turned away from Cloud, and gave him a sideways glance.
Because?
Was her only answer.
Hey you two.
Barrett roared angrily at the two, who looked at him blankly.
There ain't no time for that.
Hearing his words, Tifa ran to the door of the car and looked out. The wind was blowing her dark hair all around her face, and all she could see was a blur as the rails passed her by. They were moving so fast. Finally she nodded her head.
Yeah. I've made up my mind.
She said, sounding as confident as she could be.
Watch closely. I'm gonna jump.
Cloud and Barrett watched as Tifa took a step back and then jumped forward out of the door of the train. She disappeared the second she jumped out, lost in the blurry mess that was outside of the car. Cloud then ran to the door, and turned to Barrett.
You don't care if I go first?
He asked. Barrett glared at him.
A leader always stays till the end. Don't worry about me, just go.
Cloud nodded and turned to the door, preparing to jump.
Yo.
Barrett shouted suddenly, and Cloud glanced back. Barrett narrowed his eyes.
Don't go getting your spiky ass hurt. It's only the beginning of the mission.
Cloud shrugged and turned back to the door. Like Tifa, he took a step back and then dived forward out of the door of the car into the rails beyond. Once he was gone, Barrett stood up and turned to the car entrance, to where Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie had all gathered to see him off.
Later.
He said to them.
You take care of the rest.
Then he turned and jumped out of the car as well, leaving Biggs, Wedge and Jessie alone in the train. End of chapter. Episode 7, Part 01, Chapter 07. Chapter 7. After the valiant attempt to avoid being caught by jumping out of a fast-moving train, Cloud, Tifa and Barrett eventually found each other in the long, winding tunnels that were part of the railroad. The train had sped off at top speed towards the rest of Midgar, carrying Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge with it. Thankfully, none of them had been hurt from their fall, and only a few scrapes against the metal showed that they had jumped at all.
Good,
said Barrett, after checking that his gun arm was still intact and turning to Tifa and Cloud.
So far everything's going as planned. Better not let your guard down till we get to the Sector 5 reactor. Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie got everything ready for us. So move it. Well, the reactor should be just down this tunnel.
Barrett led the way down the tunnel in the same direction the train had been moving. Cloud and Tifa both shared a glance with one another before following him in silence. The railroad that wound its way throughout the whole of Midgar was very lonely and quiet without the sound of the train. The lights were barely working, and there were loose cables everywhere, some of them still crackling with electric sparks. There was dust everywhere, and even some of the tracks themselves were beginning to turn brown with rust. Everything was in a generally poor condition, just like the rest of Midgar. Clearly, the top bosses of Shinra didn't even care for the safety of its workers and inhabitants working for them, let alone the welfare of those reduced to living in the slums. Cloud wasn't surprised at the state of the rail tracks. He had worked for Shinra, if only in soldier, but he also knew how careless they could be. He knew Shinra did not concern itself with others, and were only concerned with lining their own pockets. That's what Midgar was, a money-sucking machine. With the reactors sucking up the Mako energy from the planet and converting it into electricity, the top people in Shinra most certainly should have heavy pockets. And Shinra was spreading. They weren't just present on one continent, but every continent on the planet. Wherever there was an abundant supply of Mako, there would be a Shinra Mako reactor, sucking it all up. And, over time, those once abundant places would become dead and dark like the land that surrounded Midgar and the people that lived in it. They didn't have to walk far before they were forced to come to a stop. After about 5 or 6 minutes of walking, the three reached the border into the next sector, but had to stop as they saw that their path was blocked. A series of green beams of light were flowing across the way and cutting them off from the next sector. Biggs had been correct when he said that Shinra would have increased their security after the events of yesterday. Now, Shinra were making sure that no one passed through close to the reactors.
These light beams are the Shinra security sensors, Cloud explained as Tifa and Barrett turned to him for an explanation. We can't go any further.
Barrett cursed loudly. He had expected a form of resistance from Shinra, but he didn't know what to do when he came across such a blockage. They could not afford to be caught. If they were caught, they would be executed, most likely without a trial. The Avalanche leader folded his arms and looked away, trying to think of a way out of their situation. Tifa looked at the sensors. The moment those sensors were touched, an alarm would sound, and they would be done for. They were just moments from the reactor, but now they were blocked off. Cloud began to look around the rest of the tunnel they were in, sure that there would be some way around the Shinra sensors. There wasn't much to look at, just a few pipes that carried electricity for the railroad, and other various things that could be used for anything. However, as he looked down to the ground, he spotted a duct. Curious, he walked over and knelt down beside it. Tifa and Barrett looked over inquiringly as the ex-soldier removed the large metal panel that covered the duct, and looked down into the vent beyond.
That's one damn tiny hole,
Barrett observed, walking over to Cloud.
You tellin' me to squeeze into that to get under the plate? No way. Yo, Cloud, what are we gonna do?
Tifa walked over and looked over Cloud's shoulder. The hole was indeed very tiny, and probably only just big enough for Barrett to squeeze in. Beyond the hole was a larger vent, big enough for the three of them, and filled with cool, but stale, air.
There seems to be nothing that'll get us stuck in this vent, she said.
Cloud nodded in agreement.
Yeah. If we go down this duct, we won't be able to come back up here,
he added gravely. He glanced over at Barrett, awaiting his decision.
Don't be wasting time,
was Barrett's angry reply.
Never know when the Shinra'll find us. Cloud, you just gotta go.
Cloud nodded.
Let's go down,
he said. Beside him, Tifa nodded. Barrett also nodded, but he still didn't look very comfortable with the decision.
But, damn man,
he groaned, looking at the tunnel.
That thing gives me the chills.
Cloud ignored Barrett's complaint and laid the lid of the duct on the ground out of the way. He then took the lead in climbing carefully into the duct, legs first, and slipped through towards the next vent. As he slipped through, he hung from the duct entrance for a second, before he let go and let himself drop onto the ground. The air vent was much larger than he expected. There was plenty of room to move around, and although the air was stale after years of neglect, it was pretty cool and airy. There was also rust forming in here, which was climbing up from the bottom of each of the interconnected plates that made up the wall. It seemed pretty quiet, with only the sound of the air echoing slightly throughout the room. Cloud turned and signaled up to Tifa and Barrett. Tifa was the next to come down. Barrett held onto her arm as gently as he could as the girl swung her legs down over the side of the duct and began to slide down, where Cloud caught her by her waist and lowered her gently to the ground. Barrett came last once more, and as he landed on the metal floor, with a thud, the sound reverberated throughout the vent and into the ducts beyond. He shrugged at Tifa and Cloud, who were glancing at him almost pitifully, before they turned and looked around for their next exit. Their exit was at the far end of the tunnel, and was simply a ladder leading deeper down into the bowels of the Midgar underground. The air coming from below the ladder was thick with the stench of oil and old metal, and didn't seem very inviting. However, this was the only route the group could take, and so they had no choice but to climb down the ladder. Again Cloud took the lead and led them down. One by one they climbed down the ladder, trying hard not to choke on the old smells that were being blown up from below. As Cloud reached the bottom of the ladder he jumped down, and his boots clattered on a large metal grating and echoed around him. While he waited for Tifa and Barrett to catch up to him, he looked around at the new area they had entered. They were by now deep in the depths of Midgar, and in the most poorly kept area. Rust was everywhere, and the smell was almost overpowering. Loud creaks could be heard everywhere, and with every step Cloud took away from the ladder those creaks became louder. As Cloud walked away from the ladder, a peculiar sound suddenly made him stop and listen in silence. At first he couldn't hear anything, but after a moment the sound came again. It sounded like a growl, faint at first but growing louder. Cautiously Cloud reached up behind him and took hold of his sword, ready to pull it out should anything appear. The depths of Midgar were notorious for being the homes of many kinds of monsters that had somehow made their way in, and bred continuously and without prohibition. The Shinra executives didn't even care about the monsters plaguing their own sewers. The growling sound came again and Cloud snapped around to look behind him, making sure that whatever the sound was it was not going to attack him from behind. Yet he could see nothing, and Tifa and Barrett had not reached the bottom of the ladder yet. Just then a ferocious snarl came from behind Cloud, this time definitely behind him. Cloud very rapidly turned back round and drew his sword, lifting it up out of its holster and over his head, swinging it down hard in front of him. There came a painful snarl of anguish and pain, before it just as rapidly fell silent. Cloud opened his eyes and looked down at the beast he had just killed. The beast was lying at his feet, with his blade still piercing its neck where he had hit it. It looked a lot like a panther, with the same thick black skin and sleek black fur, with the only difference being its long forked tail, split near the end into two long, whip-like tails. Now these tails were limp along with the rest of the cat, and completely lifeless. Cloud pulled his sword out, and looked blankly down at the creature.
"Wow!"
breathed a voice behind him. Cloud snapped back round, and saw Tifa and Barrett standing at the bottom of the ladder, staring at Cloud and the monster he had slaughtered. They both seemed a little awestruck.
"So that's what makes them people and soldiers so good,"
Barrett continued in awe.
"You guys are ruthless."
Cloud glared back at Barrett, but didn't show any hostility.
"But we're also quick,"
he added plainly. He placed his sword back behind his back. A loud whistle suddenly caught their attention, and the group turned to look across the platform, to where Wedge was waving to them.
"Cloud, this way!"
Wedge called over to them, standing by another ladder.
"The reactor's up this ladder."
Leaving the dead monster behind them, Cloud and the two members of Avalanche quickly ran over to Wedge. Wedge had now discarded his disguise and was dressed normally. As the three members approached him, he quickly ushered them up the ladder towards the next level. Jessie was on this next level, standing in a corner beside another air vent. She had her back turned to them as they climbed up, but as they approached she heard their footsteps and turned sharply. Her face was sad and full of regret, as though she had been really concerned over something, and was guilty about it.
"I'm sorry,"
the young Avalanche member apologized to them sincerely.
"The ID scan problem on the train was all my fault."
She looked at Cloud sadly.
"I made your ID card special. So that's why it happened. I put my heart into making it. But I failed. Next time, I'll give you something more decent. I'll be back at the hideout in my research room working on it."
Before anyone could say anything to comfort the crestfallen girl, she knelt down and picked up the bomb, passing it to Tifa for safekeeping. She then pointed over towards yet another ladder at the far end of the vent where she was standing. Clearly that was where they were meant to go next. Tifa gave Jessie a quick hug before the group ran over to the ladder and began to climb down into the last checkpoint, where Biggs was also waiting for them, by another ladder.
"We're gonna pull out now,"
he told them as they approached him. He seemed nervous.
"We'll meet up at the hideout. Cloud, we're counting on you to blow the reactor."
With that, Biggs turned and ran off towards the ladder leading to Jessie's section, where he quickly climbed up and disappeared. Now it was only Tifa, Barrett, and Cloud left to go onto the reactor and set the bomb that would destroy it. The three glanced at each other, nodded, and climbed up the final ladder towards the reactor chamber. As they emerged from the ladder, they found themselves in the reactor chamber, which was exactly identical to that of the number 1 reactor. Surprisingly, the reactor area seemed rather quiet and there were few guards running around. They could still be around, Barrett pointed out to them, voicing their thoughts. He walked ahead of them to the end of the platform on which they were standing, and looked down. They were a really long way up from the ground, and there were no stairs that they could use to get down. Their only route was down a long series of pipes that wound their way fairly steadily to the ground, stopping almost directly in front of the door leading inside the reactor. Barrett sat down first in the middle of the pipe, and then pushed himself off. He began to slide down the pipe, slowly at first, but gaining his speed as he slid further down towards the ground. Pretty soon he was moving very fast down the center of the pipe, until he finally reached the bottom. He staggered as his feet touched the bottom and he quickly stood up, but was just about able to regain his balance without falling over. Tifa was not far behind him, followed by Cloud. Soon they were all at the bottom of the pipe, and ready to enter the reactor chamber itself. They walked through the door and went inside. The layout of the inside was also exactly the same as that of the number 1 reactor. There was also ladders leading down and the same grated plates overlooking the rest of the reactor. And the reactor was right where they expected it to be, half embedded in the wall and standing in silence, completely unguarded. Still the three were cautious, for they did not know where the Shinra guards would be hiding and waiting to jump out at them. So they walked quietly and carefully towards the reactor. As they approached, Cloud began to feel very strange. It was a similar experience to when he first approached the number 1 reactor, which he had not told Tifa about, when that peculiar voice had spoken to him from inside his mind. A wave of nausea overcame him and he suddenly tumbled forward onto the ground. When he reopened his eyes, he could not see Tifa or Barrett. He was lying on the ground of a different metal path overlooking a vast pool of Mako, and various pipes thrusting down into it. Cloud gasped a little, and felt his heart pounding in his head. He then looked up ahead of him, and gasped again at what he saw. It was Tifa, but not the Tifa he knew now. She looked much younger, dressed in a smart red and beige dress and a wide red hat. She was kneeling beside a man, who was lying dead on the ground in front of her, killed by a sword. Tears had filled Tifa's eyes as she looked at the man in disbelief.
Papa!
She whispered, her voice choking.
Sephiroth! Sephiroth did this to you, didn't he? Sephiroth! Soldier! Mako reactors! Shinra! Everything!
She sat up and shouted at the sky.
I hate them all!
Once she had calmed her rage, she looked down at the ground again. Her gaze fell on a long and thin silver sword that was lying on the ground beside her dead father. Slowly she reached out and took hold of the handle. Her expression changed to a fearless determinism, and she got up and ran through the door. Cloud could only watch as Tifa ran through the door. His head buzzed again and he closed his eyes once more. When he reopened them he was back where he had been, on the ground in front of the number 5 reactor, with a very angry Barrett standing behind him.
Dem man, get a hold of yourself!
He was raging. Cloud blinked, confused. He looked up as Tifa, the Tifa he knew, walked over towards him and looked down at him. Her face was filled with concern, and Cloud was relieved it was not the angry determinism that had been in her face when she picked up the sword in vengeful fury.
You all right?
She asked him. Cloud stared.
Tifa.
Cloud looked down again, and shook his head.
No. Forget. Come on, let's hurry.
Tifa nodded and headed towards the reactor. Cloud slowly climbed to his feet, the nausea now gone, and turned to Barrett. The avalanche leader was standing on the entrance to the bridge, his arms folded and his face set.
I know,
Cloud sighed.
You're my watch, right?
Barrett nodded.
Demonstrate,
he said firmly.
Tifa's old friend. That ain't good enough.
Cloud shrugged dismissively, not caring. Already he was forgetting his strange experience and headed over to Tifa, who was waiting by the reactor. As Cloud walked up to her she passed him the bomb Jessie had given her. Cloud took it and knelt down beside the reactor to put it into place. He set it in exactly the same way as the previous bomb, and set it for the same time. Once the bomb was in place, the group of 3 all turned and ran away from the reactor as fast as they could, heading out the way they came and following their planned route of the reactor chamber and back up towards the surface of Midgar. Without tripping the alarm they headed up in the lift towards the very first level. Without any guards stopping them they had more time to escape, which meant it wouldn't be a close call when the bomb finally exploded. As they reached the top level they turned right across the path and into the chambers beyond, the point that they reached just yesterday when the number 1 reactor blew up around them. They ran into a room that contained 2 doors, one was open and the other was locked. Quickly they ran into the open room, which contained a series of glowing white panels.
Jessie said, "We all have to push the button at once,"
Tifa said, remembering Jessie's words. The 2 men nodded, and together they each stood by a panel. Each panel contained 2 of the glowing switches, and there were just enough of them to manage it. They counted together, and then each pressed down on the panels. A clicking sound could be heard, followed by the grating of the door in the next room as it unlocked and slid open. Without waiting, the group ran out and through the next door, heading for the exit before the bomb they had set could explode in their faces. After running out of that chamber, they found themselves on another T-junction corridor, just like the one before. Barrett ran down to the end and looked down at either end of the corridor.
"This way,"
he ordered. The other 2 followed him as he began to run down the left corridor towards the exit. As he ran, the door to the corridor opened and a number of Shinra soldiers walked in, their guns held up and ready to fire. Barrett immediately stopped and backed off away from them, until he stopped beside Cloud and Tifa.
"Shinra soldiers!"
he shouted, glaring at them.
"Shit! What the hell's going on?"
Cloud narrowed his eyes.
"A trap."
End of chapter. Episode 8, Part 01, Chapter 08. Chapter 8. The group of 3 stood frozen to the spot, while the Shinra guards blocked their one and only exit out of the reactor. They didn't dare move, for the rifles were pointing right at them, ready to fire upon them if they dared to resist. There was a deadly silence in the air, and even the sound of footsteps could be heard in the silence. In fact, they could hear the sound of footsteps, steadily approaching them from the way they had come out of the reactor. Cloud, Barrett, and Tifa turned one by one to the reactor's entrance, and watched as a figure emerged from the shadows. Barrett's jaw hung open as he saw who the figure was.
"Precy. President Shinra."
The Shinra president walked slowly out of the doorway and stopped on the path opposite the captured Avalanche members. The way he walked and the way he dressed showed his authority, confident, smart and calculative. When he spoke to them like they were dirt, and his voice sounded cold and heartless.
So you must all be that? What was it? Avalanche?
Barrett roared, shaking his fists.
And don't you forget it. And you're President Shinra, hey.
Cloud stepped forward onto the path and faced the president.
"Long time no see, President." "Long time no see?"
President Shinra asked, sounding confused. He looked at Cloud closely, when he realized who he was.
"Oh. You're the one who quit Soldier and joined Avalanche. I knew you had been exposed to Mako, from the look in your eyes. Tell me, traitor. What was your name?" "Cloud."
President Shinra nodded.
"Forgive me for asking,"
he asked of Cloud.
"But I can't be expected to remember each person's name. Unless you become another Sephiroth." "Yes, Sephiroth. He was brilliant. Perhaps too brilliant."
Cloud's body jerked at the mention of the name. He stepped back almost fearfully, and his face went as pale as a ghost.
"Sephiroth."
While Cloud was standing awestruck in the middle of the path, Barrett ran forward and brushed rudely past Cloud. He ran halfway up and shook his fists at the Shinra president, his arrogance returning.
"Don't give a damn about none of that,"
he raged, trying to intimidate the president.
"This place is going up with a big bang soon. Serves y'all right. And such a waste of good fireworks, just to get rid of vermin like you."
President Shinra replied calmly, not at all intimidated by Barrett's angry tone. Of course, Barrett wasn't too pleased with the statement.
"Vermin,"
he shouted furiously, looking ready to explode with his fury.
"That's all you can say? Vermin."
He took another step forward and pointed his gun arm at the president.
"Y'all Shinra the vermin, killing the planet. And that makes you King Vermin. So shoo up, jackass."
President Shinra arrogantly rolled his eyes, unimpressed.
"You are beginning to bore me,"
he said, his voice solemn. He then looked up at the group once more.
"I'm a very busy man, so if you'll excuse me. I have a dinner I must attend."
Barrett could not believe his ears.
"Dinner? Don't give me that. I ain't even started with you yet." "But,"
the president added quickly,
"I've made arrangements for a playmate for you all."
The president then clicked his fingers, and the sound of the click echoed throughout the corridor. The echo then faded, and was replaced by a faint buzzing sound that was growing in intensity, and was heading towards them. Tifa looked up and glanced around the paths, trying to find the source of the buzzing.
"What's that noise?"
she asked. Barrett ran back down onto the main path, brushing past Cloud once again, and ran over to Tifa. The door on the other side of the path was open, and the buzzing seemed to have been coming from there. It was still growing louder, and sounded like the whirring of blades. Eventually, something began to emerge from the shadows.
"The hell is this?"
he demanded. The source of the sound then emerged from the doorway and onto the path. It moved at such a speed that Tifa and Barrett had to stand really close to the ends of the path to avoid being knocked off by its bulk. It then stopped in the middle of the path, separating Cloud from his friends. It was a gigantic robot, another of Shinra's defensive weaponry. Unlike the Robo-Guard, which had been disadvantaged on the ground, this robot could hover a few feet off the ground. It was armed with a range of weaponry, from cannons to guns in its back and front. Its only disadvantage was that, because it was so large and packed full of weaponry, it was hard for it to turn or move very quickly. The whirring sound came from its fast-moving blades that whirred beneath its bulk, keeping it hovering above the ground.
"Meet Airbuster,"
the president introduced, waving a hand to the creation hovering in front of him.
"A techno-soldier. Our weapon development department created him. I'm sure the data he'll extract from your dead bodies will be of great use to us in future experiments."
Cloud stared at the robot in awe.
"Techno-soldier."
The sound of more whirring blades could be heard as a helicopter rose up from the abyss beneath the paths, and hovered beside the president. The door opened, ready for the president to board.
"Now then, if you'll excuse me,"
the president said politely, giving a little bow to the group. He turned towards the helicopter.
"Wait, President,"
Cloud called, running forwards towards the helicopter. He was too late. The helicopter had already lowered itself and was letting President Shinra on board. Cloud could only stop and watch as the door to the helicopter was slammed shut, and the helicopter began to rise up away from them, flying off towards Shinra headquarters once more. The Shinra president had fled, and the guard had already scattered, leaving Cloud and his friends alone with Shinra's latest weapon.
"Yo, Cloud,"
Barrett called to Cloud.
"We've gotta do something about him."
Cloud turned back, just in time to see Airbuster moving forward towards Barrett and Tifa. The two Avalanche members backed up fearfully as the robot approached. Even though it was hovering above the ground, the path was still vibrating beneath its whirring blades. It moved forward a little more, and the two backed up again.
"Help, Cloud!"
Tifa shouted over the whirring of the blades.
"This is from Soldier." "No way!"
Cloud called back from the other side of the robot.
"It's just a machine."
Hearing Cloud's voice, Airbuster slowly began to turn around to face Cloud. It towered over him by a good couple of meters, and its armor was very thick so it would not be easy to penetrate. Cloud reached behind him and drew his large sword, ready to battle. And although he couldn't see them, Barrett was preparing his gun and Tifa was flexing her fists. Each of them was preparing for the inevitable battle.
"I don't care what it is,"
Barrett said.
"I'm gonna bust him up."
With that, Barrett raised his gun and fired upon Airbuster. The bullet rippled against its armor, making only dents and no significant damage. Airbuster gently jerked its head to the right to glance at Barrett through its flashing red eyes, but it did not turn. Instead, Airbuster opened up an almost seamless hatch on its back, to reveal a rifle that had been hidden there. Airbuster fired at Barrett, and the Avalanche leader had to quickly jump back on the path to avoid being shot or knocked off the edge of the path. It was a very long way to the slums below, and no one could afford to take that drop. While Airbuster's attention was focused on Barrett, Cloud took his chance and ran forward, hoping to ram his sword into a vital part of the robot's machinery before it could force anyone off the path. He jumped up and swiped his sword. It struck Airbuster's side with a terrific flash of light as the metal collided with metal. Airbuster turned its head back down to look at Cloud as he pressed his blade against the side of the robot. It then swung one of its large robotic arms and threw Cloud away from him. Cloud was flung back across the path, and landed with a heavy thud on the ground halfway across the path. His sword clattered to the floor and Cloud rolled and rolled across the metal path, before finally coming to a stop. Just as Cloud finished rolling, a bright flash of orange and red lit up the path, causing Airbuster to jerk violently. A cloud of flames suddenly rose up around it and enveloped it, before the flames dissipated and disappeared. Airbuster's metal frame glowed slightly from the heat of the fire, but eventually began to cool. Tifa lowered her arms, and the second ball of materia within her armlet slot ended its fiery glow. She flicked her hair back in satisfaction.
Tifa! Look out!
Came Barrett's voice. Tifa looked up in surprise to see a large heavy object falling towards her. It looked like a cannonball and was falling towards her. Quickly Tifa dodged to the side and out of the way of the ball. The cannonball slammed down onto the metal path, causing it to shake and quiver violently. It even bounced, for a second or two, before rolling over the end of the path and falling down into the murky cloud of smoke that covered the slums. It was such a long drop that no one could hear the ball land, but they prayed that it didn't land on any of the houses. Tifa wiped her forehead with her glove, relieved that Barrett had warned her in time before the cannonball had hit her. She looked back over towards Barrett, who was busy firing upon the robot. Airbuster had turned and was busy advancing on Barrett. As Tifa watched, Airbuster opened up another hatch on its chest and revealed a double rifle, and fired at Barrett once again. Like before, Barrett was forced to back up on the path to avoid the bullets that hit the floor at his feet, just inches from striking him. It almost looked funny, for he was jumping back from foot to foot. It was just a shame that the situation was so serious. The young woman raised her arms again, and once more the glowing ball of materia in her glove slot began to glow. Fiery sparks flickered within it, and a ball of fire began to form between Tifa's hands. Tifa then thrust her hands out in front of her, and the ball of fire fired from her palms and towards Airbuster as it fired upon Barrett. The fireball hit the nose of the rifles, and their nozzles glowed brightly with the intense heat. They glowed brighter and brighter as the flames burned around it, until eventually the nozzles began to droop and sag downward, melting with the heat. Eventually the rifles stopped firing bullets, unable to fire anymore as the nozzles melted so much that the barrels closed up. Cloud finally climbed to his feet after recovering from his fall, and saw his chance while the robot tried to figure out what to do now that its prime weapon had been disabled. He spun his sword round and quickly placed it back behind his back, freeing his hands for the task at hand. Like Tifa, he held out his hands, and a single ball of green materia from his own armlet slot began to glow, filled with an electric yellow light. As he opened his eyes, a bolt of lightning suddenly fired down from the sky and onto the head of the robot. The electricity quickly spread over its body and flickered between all of the nooks and crannies within its framework. The electricity then stopped flickering, and everyone waited. All at once the robot stopped moving, standing frozen in the middle of the path. Slowly it jerked its head from side to side, trying to turn its large bulk around on the path so it could continue to attack. However, the lightning that Cloud had cast had somehow short-circuited its turn system, and was motionless. This was the chance the group needed. All at once they all charged forward, their weapons high and ready, and began to attack Airbuster together. Barrett raised his gun arm and fired repeatedly, striking all of the robot's weak spots that it couldn't defend by turning away. He particularly aimed at the robot's hover system and engine, hoping to cut its power system before it could hit them. Tifa dodged Barrett's bullets and went right up close to the robot, punching and kicking at the weak spots on the framework that Barrett had done damage to. Cloud was on the other side, continuously swiping his sword and creating long, deep slashes in the metal. Eventually they had done the damage they needed, and they all pulled back. Airbuster remained motionless, its head still jerking from side to side. Then, gradually, its body began to shake as the damage began to take its toll. Electric sparks began to crackle from its damaged circuit boards, and the shaking began to get more violent. All of a sudden the robot exploded, its body unable to take any more damage. Large chunks of metal flew into the air, and the path shook as the explosion shook it apart. Tifa and Barrett held onto the sides as the path shook violently beneath their feet, and it was all they could do to stop themselves from falling over the edge. Cloud, on the other hand, was not as lucky as Tifa and Barrett. As Airbuster self-destructed and destroyed the bridge, Cloud lost his footing and tumbled over the edge of the broken ledge. Quickly he reached up and grabbed hold of a pipe that was sticking out of the edge of the bridge. His sword fell past him and down into the murkiness below, while Cloud was left dangling on the edge of the bridge, completely helpless. Tifa ran to the edge of the bridge and leaned down. Cloud was on the other side and was too far down for her to reach, but that didn't stop her from leaning over as far as she could and reaching for Cloud, desperate to save him before he could fall to his death.
"It's gotta blow,"
Barrett called from behind her.
"Let's go, Tifa."
Tifa shook her head, her dark hair falling around her face.
"Barrett,"
she said pleadingly.
"Can't you do something?"
Slowly Barrett shook his head.
"Not a damn thing."
Tifa's eyes filled up and she turned back to Cloud. He was still dangling, trying hard not to lose his grip on the pipe. But he was failing fast, and his grip was slowly beginning to slacken.
Cloud.
Tifa called down to him.
Please don't die. You can't die. There's still so much I want to tell you.
Cloud didn't look up from the pipe. He was more focused on trying to maintain his grip on the pipe.
I know, Tifa,
was his only reply. Tifa's eyes filled once more.
Hey, you gonna be alright?
Barrett shouted down over the edge. Cloud muttered silently. He did want to curse at Barrett at that moment, but he managed to control himself.
You worry about yourselves. I'm alright, but take care of Tifa. Alright,
said Barrett.
Sorry about all this. Stop talking like this is the end.
Cloud snapped. Barrett nodded.
Alright, then, later.
At that very moment a loud explosion occurred from deep within the reactor, and the whole area rumbled violently. Then, like an earthquake, the reactor exploded. The door leading into the reactor burst open and flames erupted from within it, beginning to fill the corridor. The force of the explosion shook the broken bridge, and Cloud finally lost his battle to keep his hold and began to fall down away from Tifa, who cried out in dismay as she watched Cloud fall away from her. Barrett reached out and grabbed hold of Tifa roughly, beginning to drag the girl away from the bridge before the flames could reach them. Tifa struggled hard and continued to reach for Cloud, but there was nothing she could do as Barrett dragged her forcefully away, leaving Cloud to fall into the murky clouds of the slums below, where he disappeared from view completely. End of chapter. Episode 9, Part 01, Chapter 09. Chapter 9. You all right? Can you hear me? Cloud didn't move, and remained motionless. He could hear the voice faintly in his head, the same as before, but he didn't recognize it or react to it.
Yeah,
was all he said. Back then, you could get by with just skinned knees.
What do you mean by back then?
Cloud asked. What about now? Can you get up?
What do you mean by that time?
Cloud insisted on asking.
What about now?
Don't worry about me. You just worry about yourself now.
I'll give it a try.
He tried to move. He could feel it very distantly, as though his spirit was not completely attached to his body.
Oh. It moved.
Came a voice. How about that?
Whew. I am glad.
Take it slow now. Little by little.
Hello, hello. I know. Hey. Who are you? Hello, hello.
The voice did not reply again, and Cloud's mind remained empty. Slowly he jerked his body one more time, and this time all the feeling came back to him. It felt as though his spirit had suddenly reattached to his physical body, making him jump violently and regain all feeling at once. His body ached heavily, and there were sharp pains under his head and back as though he had landed on something hard. There was also a gentle prickly feeling on the back of his neck and under his arms, but he couldn't make out what it was. It was only as he began to come round that he remembered what had happened. He remembered the reactor exploding, and he had fallen from the bridge and into the depths of the slums below. The last thing that he remembered was crashing into something hard before everything turned black and he was lost in the darkness, only to come round to the sound of that mysterious voice speaking to him. Cloud slowly opened his eyes and blinked as a bright light hit them. As he focused more clearly, he stared upwards towards a young female face that was looking back down at him. Cloud stared at her for a few moments and blinked before he suddenly sat up, slightly embarrassed.
You okay?
The woman asked him gently, standing up. Cloud turned his head around to look at her.
This is a church in the Sector 5 slums. It suddenly fell on top of me. It really gave me a scare.
Cloud didn't answer and looked down. He was sitting on a rugged arrangement of broken planks of wood, which he had brought crashing down when he smashed through the church wood during his fall. He was also sitting on a beautiful flower bed filled with brightly colored flowers. It was the short lengths of grass and the flowery petals that had been tickling his neck. Seeing the planks, Cloud looked up, and there, right above him, was the gaping hole in the church roof caused by his fall.
I came crashing down?
He asked, still dazed. The young woman nodded at him.
The roof and the flower bed must have broken your fall, she told him. You're lucky. Flower bed?
Cloud said, confused. He looked back down at the flowers, which were lying crushed beneath his weight and those of the planks.
Is this yours?
Hurriedly he jumped up off the flower bed before he could destroy any more of them. He picked up his sword from the ground and turned to the woman sheepishly.
Sorry about that. That's all right,
the woman said. She smiled at Cloud as she glanced towards the flower bed.
The flowers here are quite resilient because this is a sacred place.
She turned away from Cloud and looked around the rest of the church.
They say you can't grow grass and flowers in Midgar. But for some reason, the flowers have no trouble blooming here. I love it here.
Cloud slowly nodded his head. Midgar and the land that surrounded Midgar was very dark and lifeless because of the Mako reactors sucking up the energy, but the flower bed in the church was filled with brightly colored flowers, and the grass was very green. He knew himself that grass and flowers could not be grown anywhere where there was a Mako reactor, but obviously, as the woman had said, they had no trouble blooming in the church.
So, we meet again,
said the woman suddenly. Cloud looked down in surprise and saw the woman kneeling down beside him, tending to the injured flowers before they could die. She looked up into Cloud's face, and noticed that his expression was blank. She stood up and stared at him in dismay.
Don't you remember me?
Cloud crossed his arms and thought for a moment, trying to remember where he had seen this girl before, for she clearly remembered him. At first he could not remember her because he was still slightly dazed from the fall, but as he recovered a little more he could remember her. She was the flower girl in Sector 8, whom he had met after the destruction of the No. 1 reactor, and had sold him the 2 flowers he had given to Marlene and Tifa. He nodded.
Yeah, I remember,
he said.
You were selling flowers.
The woman smiled in relief.
Oh, I'm so happy, she said. Thanks for buying my flowers.
She stopped suddenly, as though she had just remembered something.
Say, do you have any materia?
Cloud tilted his head, confused by her question.
Yes, some, he replied. Nowadays you can find materia anywhere. But mine is special,
the woman told him almost boastingly.
It's good for absolutely nothing. Good for nothing?
He asked her. He shook his head.
You probably just don't know how to use it.
Now the woman shook her head.
No, I do.
She insisted.
It just doesn't do anything. I feel safe just having it. It was my mother's.
She paused for a moment and looked up at the sky in silent prayer, while Cloud just watched her. When she was done she looked down and turned to Cloud again, the smile back on her face.
Say, I feel like talking. Do you feel up to it? After all, here we are meeting again, right?
Cloud shrugged.
I don't mind. Wait here, the woman told him. I've got to check my flowers.
With that the woman quickly jogged over to the other side of the flower bed. She stopped and smiled, something she appeared to do quite often. Then she knelt back down and began to tend to her flowers once more. While she was doing that, Cloud looked around the rest of the church. It had clearly been abandoned and unused for many years, and the aisle benches were broken and crumbling, and were thick with dirt and dust. The floor was cracked and broken, and the flower bed itself was growing up out of a large hole in the floor. Slowly Cloud walked around the perimeter of the flower bed and stopped beside the girl as she tended to her flowers, and he could hear her muttering quietly to herself as she worked.
Just a little longer, she was saying.
She then blinked.
Oh.
She stood up and quickly turned to Cloud, who was standing behind her.
Now that you mention it. We don't know each other's names, do we? I'm Aerith, the flower girl. Nice to meet you.
Cloud nodded.
The name's Cloud,
he introduced.
Me? I do a little bit of everything.
Aerith grinned.
Oh. A jack of all trades. Yeah,
said Cloud.
I do whatever's needed.
He stopped as he saw that Aerith had suddenly turned away from him. She had her hands over her mouth as she giggled to herself.
What's so funny? What are you laughing at?
Aerith finally stopped laughing and turned to Cloud, shaking her head.
Sorry. I just...
She suddenly stopped and looked over Cloud's shoulder. All at once her expression changed from one of laughter, to one of fear. She looked back at Cloud.
Say, Cloud. Have you ever been a bodyguard? You do everything, right?
Cloud tilted his head again.
Yeah, that's right.
Aerith sighed heavily. She then reached out and grabbed hold of Cloud's hand, which made him jump violently.
Then, get me out of here,
she asked him, almost pleadingly.
Take me home.
Cloud stared and blinked blankly, surprised by Aerith's sudden change.
Okay, I'll do it,
he said. He quickly added,
but it'll cost you. Well then, let's see,
Aerith said. She crossed her arms and thought for a moment. Then she smiled as she thought of the perfect idea.
How about if I go out with you once?
This time Cloud really stared, and even jumped back unexpectedly. That wasn't the kind of pay he had meant. He usually only worked for cash. Then he remembered that this girl was living in the slums, selling flowers to earn her way, and so she could not afford to pay him the kind of money he would usually ask for. So eventually he nodded, and turned around to where Aerith was looking. There was a man standing in the middle of the aisles watching them. He had come in silently while Aerith and Cloud were talking, and it was his entry that had made Aerith so nervous so suddenly. He was dressed in a blue suit, although he wore it rather scruffily with his jacket undone and his shirt hanging out over his waist. His hair was long but tied back in a ponytail, with a few long strips of fringe hanging over his face. His expression was rather cold and cruel, and Cloud got the impression that he wasn't a friend of Aerith's. This was the reason why she had become so nervous.
I don't know who you are,
Cloud said to the man.
But you don't know me.
I know you.
Oh yeah,
said Cloud, just as he realized the man's identity.
I know you. That uniform.
The door to the church suddenly burst open as 3 Shinra soldiers, clad in their blue uniforms and rifles, charged in. Aerith jumped and cowered behind Cloud as they ran up to the man in the aisles, seeming to laugh and snigger at the two as they were cornered in the middle of the church.
Hey sis, this one's a little weird,
one of the soldiers called over to Aerith. Cloud glared.
Shut up. You Shinra spy.
Another of the soldiers turned to the suited man in front of them.
Reno. Want him taken out.
The man known as Reno slowly turned his head to the soldiers, his expression unchanged. He did not seem at all interested in Cloud, or intimidated by him.
I haven't decided yet,
was all he said. Aerith ran forward desperately.
Don't fight here,
she pleaded with them.
You'll run the flowers.
She turned and ran back past Cloud, and stopped beside a door leading out at the back of the church hall.
The exit is back there,
she called to Cloud. Cloud glanced back at Reno and the 3 Shinra soldiers, who were still laughing with amusement. He put one hand on the handle of his blade before he turned and ran after Aerith. She opened the door as he approached, and together they ran through, slamming the door shut as they ran through. Reno just stood and watched as Cloud and Aerith ran away from him, still seeming unbothered by their escape. He slowly walked forward down the aisle until he reached the flower bed. He didn't stop as he reached the flowers, instead he walked right over them. The flowers were easily crushed under the weight of his boots, leaving them lying flat and crumpled behind him. He stopped in the middle of the bed, looking down in thought.
They were Mako eyes,
he mumbled thoughtfully to himself. He looked up and turned to the guards.
Yeah, all right. Back to work, back to work.
He turned back and headed towards the door. But he suddenly stopped and thought for a moment, before he turned back to the guards.
Oh. And don't step on the flowers.
He turned and flicked his hair. The 3 Shinra soldiers stared.
Hey, Reno. You just stepped on them. They're all ruined. You're gonna catch holy hell.
Beyond the door, Cloud and Aerith stood alone in the back hall of the church, which was in an even worse condition than the front of the church. All the staircases that led up to the balconies were broken apart, and some stairs just hung in mid-air while their compatible counterparts lay in a heap on the ground. However, they could not afford to stand around and wait for Reno and the guards to catch up to them. Cloud watched Aerith as she ran to the end of the floor and jumped over to the broken stairs that led up to the next floor. He wondered why she was so desperate to get away from the guards, or why they appeared to be after her in the first place. Still, she had asked him to be her bodyguard, so he ran to the end and jumped over the ledge towards her, where they continued to run up the stairs. They were forced to come to a stop just a few moments later as they reached a large gap in the floor ahead of them, which hung right over a long drop to the bottom floor below.
"There they are, over there,"
came a voice. Cloud and Aerith looked down in a fright as they saw the door to the hall thrown open, where it broke away from its hinges and tumbled to the floor. Reno and the guards then ran in and looked around in search of Aerith. They finally spotted her on the floor above.
"Cloud? That one?"
Aerith shouted to Cloud fearfully. Cloud nodded.
"I know. Looks like they aren't going to let us go. What should we do?"
Cloud turned to her.
"Well, we can't let them catch us, can we?"
he asked her. Aerith nodded.
"Then, there's only one thing left."
With that, Cloud turned to the gap bridged between him and the other side of the ledge. He took a step backward for a run, and then ran forward and jumped over the gap. He landed on the other side quite easily, where he rolled over on the broken wood. When he stopped rolling, he climbed to his feet and signaled to Aerith.
"Aerith! This way!"
Aerith stepped up to the edge of the broken ridge and looked down. It was a frightfully long drop to the ground below, and with her long pink dress she wasn't totally sure that she'd make the jump. She swallowed hard and shook her head, not wanting to take the risk of falling into her pursuer's hands.
"All right,"
said Cloud, understanding.
"I'll hold them off."
"Right," said Aerith.
"Make sure they don't get through." "The ancient is getting away,"
shouted Reno, sounding angry for the first time.
"Attack! Attack! Attack!"
The three soldiers all raised their guns and aimed for Aerith, as she stood isolated on the beams, in plain view of their guns. The soldiers opened fire, and the bullets hit the underside of the wood around Aerith's feet. The wooden plank shook violently as it was riddled with bullets, and Aerith struggled to keep her balance. She eventually lost the fight and tumbled over the edge.
"Ei! Aerith!"
Cloud yelled. Aerith landed on a pipe just beneath the floor, and slid down. She passed Reno and the guards on her way, until she reached the pipe's end and fell onto the open basement floor, completely open and vulnerable. On the ground floor, Reno glanced down at Aerith, as she lay helpless on the floor.
"Think we killed him?"
he wondered aloud.
"They shouldn't have put up a fight, I say."
He signaled to one of his soldiers, who immediately ran to the edge and jumped down towards the basement where Aerith lay. The girl sat up as the soldier landed in front of her, and looked up fearfully as her attacker approached with his gun at the ready.
"Cloud, help!"
she cried. Cloud was still on the first floor, looking down helplessly as the Shinra soldier approached Aerith.
"Damn!"
he cursed. He looked around desperately for something he could use to help Aerith without getting shot himself. There was nothing he could use on the floor he was on, there was only broken wood lying around, and that wouldn't help Aerith at all. He looked up above him towards the roof beams, and saw that there were barrels placed on various beams.
"What's that?"
he wondered aloud. He then had an idea, and turned down to Aerith.
"Aerith! Fight him!"
Down on the basement floor, Aerith looked up fearfully at the soldier standing in front of her. Hearing Cloud's words, she looked even more terrified, but eventually nodded.
All right."
With that, she stood up and faced the soldier. She had no weapons of her own other than her bare fists, and she wasn't strong enough to take him out in one punch. The soldier laughed in delight and amusement, for he knew he was stronger and much better equipped than Aerith was. Still, Aerith had a plan of sorts. As she looked around, she spotted a large piece of broken pipe lying on the ground nearby. The soldier spotted it at the same, and they both lunged at the same time for it. Aerith reached the pipe quicker and pulled it towards her. The soldier cursed loudly as he fell onto the ground, and began to fumble for his gun to defend himself. He wasn't quick enough, however, as Aerith had hold of the pipe and swung it around with all her strength. There was an almighty cracking sound as the pipe connected with the soldier's helmet. The soldier dropped his gun and crumpled onto the floor, a long crack down the side of his helmet. He wasn't seriously hurt, just knocked unconscious, but he would have an almighty headache when he woke up. Aerith, surprised at the ease of defeating her attacker, kept the pipe in her hands as she ran on towards the stairs leading to the ground floor. Cloud, meanwhile, was busy climbing up the last set of stairs that led up to the attic beams that crossed over the hull of the church hall, in particular heading for the old heavy barrels that were balanced on the beams. The stairs were so old they were rotting, and as he climbed one step broke beneath him, and he nearly fell straight through to the floor below once more. He just managed to stay on the stairs by grabbing onto the other stairs, and began to climb once again.
"Ei!"
came Aerith's terrified cry.
"Cloud, help!"
Cloud looked down from the stairs, and saw Aerith at the bottom of the stairs leading to the ground floor. She had the pipe in her hands, but there was already a soldier standing on the stairs waiting for her, his gun at the ready and ready to fire at her. But there was nothing that Cloud could do just yet.
"Fight him!"
he called. Aerith nodded.
All right."
While Aerith began her fight with the other guard, Cloud continued to climb the stairs and onto the beams that overlooked the rest of the hall. The beams were just as old as the rest of the church, but they still looked fairly strong and could probably just about support him. Carefully he stepped onto the thick beams. He had to be careful because the beams were not very wide, and was only just wide enough for him to stand on. But Cloud had good balance, and was able to make his way fairly quickly across towards the barrels. He stopped very suddenly as the sound of gunfire could be heard, followed by Aerith's scream. Cloud stood frozen on the beams fearfully as he thought the worst. He had no need to worry though, for moments later there came a loud crack, followed by a painful grunt from the Shinra soldier. He looked down just in time to see the soldier fall and roll down the stairs behind Aerith, where he lay unconscious and defeated. Aerith then continued to run up the stairs, making her way gradually towards Cloud. Now unfrozen, Cloud managed to make his way over towards one of the barrels. They were firm and very heavy, although he didn't know what they were filled with. He figured they could probably be pushed very easily.
"Cloud, help!"
As Cloud looked down, he saw Aerith standing on the stairs directly leading to the first floor directly beneath him. Her only weapon was lying on the floor on the basement floor, knocked from her hands as the final Shinra guard attacked her from behind as she ran up the stairs. Now she was defenseless, and at the mercy of the guard.
"Hold on a minute,"
Cloud called down to her. He turned back to the barrel and began to push it hard. It was indeed very heavy, and for a moment Cloud thought it might not move at all. Then eventually it began to move, and as Cloud pushed it more it lost its balance and began to fall towards the stairs beneath him. It missed Aerith only by inches. It slammed into the stairs on its side, and began to roll down towards the guard. The Shinra soldier jumped back fearfully as the barrel rolled towards him, but he was not quick enough to flee from it. The barrel hit him and pushed him to the floor, rolling right over him before falling off the edge of the stairs and onto the basement floor below. All he could do was lie dazed as Aerith ran away from him and across the gap in the floor as she headed towards Cloud. As Aerith climbed the stairs, Cloud held out a hand to her and helped her up. She was pale and shaking from her ordeal, but at least she wasn't hurt.
"Aerith, this way,"
he told her. He led her carefully across the beams towards the large hole in the roof that he had created himself when he fell from the upper plate. He let Aerith go first through the hole and out of the church to safety, before he finally followed her. End of chapter. Episode 10, Part 01, Chapter 10. Chapter 10. After their frantic escape of the Sector 5 church, Cloud and Aerith both sat panting on top of the church roof, trying to catch their breath after what they had just gone through. Aerith was gradually beginning to return to her normal color now that she was away from the guards that were desperate to catch her, while Cloud was merely exhausted from his long climbs and attempts to save Aerith. There was no sign of Reno or the soldiers since they escaped via the roof, and thought that maybe they had given up the chase now that they were out of their reach. Still, Cloud knew that people like that never gave up easily, and there was still a chance they could come after them again.
"Ha, ha,"
Aerith said, laughing a little in relief of their escape. Cloud looked at her in bewilderment. The young woman brushed her brown hair out her face and took a deep breath of air, even if it was the stale, musty air of the slums.
"They're looking for me again."
Cloud stared.
"You mean it's not the first time they've been after you?"
Aerith looked down and pulled her knees up close to her chest. She then wrapped her arms around them to hold them close to her, and gently lay her chin down on her kneecaps. She looked very somber and serious, very different from the cheerful happiness of before.
"No. They're the Turks." "The Turks are an organization in Shinra,"
Cloud explained to her.
"They scout for possible candidates for soldier." "This violently?"
Aerith asked in surprise, lifting her head up from her knees.
"I thought they were kidnapping someone."
Cloud nodded.
They're also involved in a lot of dirty stuff on the side, he added. Spying, murder. You know.
Aerith did know. She put her head back on her knees.
They look like it,
she muttered gravely. She closed her eyes for a few moments and took another deep breath, still in shock.
But, why are they after you?
Asked Cloud.
There must be a reason, right? No, not really,
replied Aerith, opening her eyes. She shrugged.
I think they believe I have what it takes to be in soldier. Maybe you do,
said Cloud, looking her over.
You want to join?
Aerith shrugged again.
I don't know,
she admitted. She lifted her head.
But I don't want to get caught by those people. Then, let's go.
Cloud said, climbing to his feet. Aerith climbed to her feet beside him, and together they began to head off across the rooftops away from the church, before Reno and his soldiers could get their acts together and come after them. Cloud took the lead as they jumped across the rooftops, the easiest way to make some distance from the church without being seen. Officially, it wasn't rooftops they were jumping over, rather piles and piles of leftover junk that had gathered and collected outside of Sector 5. Once upon a time people actually lived in that part of the slums, but over the years the land had become a waste yard, with the church at the center of it all. As Cloud jumped along, a few feet at a time, he kept an eye out for anyone wandering around on the ground below. As sad as it appeared, there were many people in the slums who would willingly turn people into the authorities in the hope that they would be rewarded, and they often hung around waste yards such as these in the hope of mugging unsuspecting travelers. So Cloud kept up a quick pace as he jogged from pile to pile, looking for a decent place for them to jump down.
Wait!
Came Aerith's faint voice behind him.
Wait, I said.
Cloud came to a stop on a metal panel, and turned to look behind him. Aerith was a good few meters behind him, standing on the edge of a large chunk of metal over a small drop. She carefully swung her arms back and to before finally making the jump onto the ground below, right beside another jump. She did the same thing by swinging her arms and jumping daintily to the ground, finally reaching the level that Cloud was on and running towards him. She stopped beside him and leaned over, her arms on her knees, panting heavily.
Puff. Wheeze.
She panted heavily, trying to get her breath back once again.
Slow down. Don't leave me.
Cloud tilted his head to the side in amusement. Aerith was a difficult person to try and read. When he first saw her she had appeared gentle and smiling, and not the kind of person who could be violent towards others. Yet, in the church, she had found it very easily to pick up a pipe and hit one of the Shinra soldiers around the head, and could possibly be a good soldier candidate. Now here she was, once again back to her delicate self, unable to keep up with him on the rooftops.
Funny,
Cloud said, observing the differences within her.
I thought you were cut out to be in soldier.
Aerith immediately pushed herself up and put her hands on her hips stubbornly.
Oh. You're terrible.
She shouted at him angrily. She then glared at him fiercely. Cloud stared back at her with equal intensity. They held one another's gazes for just a few seconds before they burst out into a fit of laughter, both equally amused by their actions. Aerith was the first to stop laughing, and looked at Cloud's face. Cloud felt her gaze on him as he stopped laughing, and stared back at Aerith. The young woman looked at him for a few moments more.
Hey! Cloud,
she said suddenly, the laughter gone from her voice.
Were you ever in soldier?
Cloud mumbled quietly. He wasn't sure how to answer that question, when he knew many people feared and hated soldier.
I used to be.
He answered finally.
How did you guess?
Aerith pointed to her own green eyes.
Your eyes,
she remarked.
They have a strange glow.
Cloud again wasn't sure how to answer. He knew that his eyes did have a peculiar glow that made them stand out against the eyes of others, but it wasn't usually that noticeable unless someone was clearly taking notice. Obviously, Aerith had been looking at him very closely to notice the glow.
That's the sign of those who have been infused with Mako,
he told her, feeling it was all right to tell her.
A mark of soldier. But, how did you know about that?
Aerith looked around evasively.
Oh, nothing. Nothing.
Aerith nodded her head firmly.
Right, nothing,
she said. She pointed onward.
Come on, let's go. Bodyguard.
Cloud nodded, and turned away as he began to carry on across the waste. Aerith continued to follow him, but it wasn't long before she was falling behind once again, unable to keep up with Cloud's pace. They soon found a space to jump down, but they were forced to wait a few moments more while a single man walked slowly across the waste yard. Once he was out of sight, Cloud emerged from the rubbish and jumped down towards the ground, where he turned and waited for Aerith. Aerith was, as he expected, a few paces behind him. He waited while she made her short, careful jumps, being careful not to tear her dress as she jumped. She eventually reached the ground and stood beside Cloud, sighing with relief.
"Whew! Finally made it off!"
she exclaimed.
"Now what?"
Cloud watched her while she ran ahead of him and looked around, trying to get her bearings right. Down one end she could see the church not too far away, and so she pointed down the other path.
"My house is over here," she said to Cloud. "Hurry before he comes."
Cloud nodded, and ran after Aerith as she ran down the path towards Sector 5. They had no problems down the rest of the way, and soon emerged into Sector 5 of the Midgar slums. Cloud could see the differences between Sector 5 and Sector 7 instantly. There were a lot less people in this sector. It was just as dirty as he expected, but the prime difference was that there was a gentle smell of freshness in the air, something Cloud did not expect. Aerith walked ahead of Cloud and stopped next to a large, round pipe, the entrance to one of the slum houses, a sign that the people of Midgar really did use anything and everything to keep a roof over their heads. The young woman pointed to the inside of the pipe.
"This guy is sick,"
she said to him, motioning inside the pipe.
"He passed out nearby and someone must have helped him here."
She walked in through the open pipe doorway. Cloud followed her, and saw her on the inside standing next to a man who was sitting up on the bed. Aerith had been right, the guy did look sick. His face was slightly pale and shaking, and he was trembling slightly. From the slightly vacant expression on his face, Cloud figured he was probably on drugs, for he could not even talk properly or even acknowledge they were there.
"Ooh. Ah. Ack,"
was all he could muster to say. Aerith stood up beside him.
"This is the one?"
she said, putting a hand on the sick man's shoulder. She looked up at Cloud earnestly.
"Won't you help him?" "Ooh. Ah. Ack."
The man groaned again, although he wasn't replying to anyone. Cloud crossed his arms and looked at Aerith.
"Listen, I'm no doctor," he said. "No. I guess not,"
Aerith admitted sadly. It had been a false hope, but she knew she had to try. She looked up again.
"Hey. That man has a tattoo. I think it was the number 2.
She pointed to his arm, and Cloud spotted the black tattoo imprinted roughly on his arm. It did look kind of like the number 2. He thought it was a strange thing to have as a tattoo, but the man was in no condition to answer him. Aerith and Cloud soon left the man to his oohing and awing and carried on towards Aerith's house, with Aerith leading the way. As they reached Aerith's house, Cloud discovered where the fresh smell was coming from, and stared in absolute amazement. Aerith's house was actually a house, and not a building built roughly out of scrap metal. Also, beside the house there was a large garden, and this was where the fresh smell was coming from. The garden was filled to the brim with beautiful flowers and grass, releasing a dozen pleasant fragrances into the air. It was a completely tranquil setting, and seemed completely out of place compared to the rest of the slums. Aerith walked in through the unlocked door of the house. Cloud followed her almost nervously, unsure of what to expect inside.
"I'm home, Mom,"
Aerith called as she stood inside the house. Cloud looked around the inside of the house, and found that it was just as comforting inside as it was on the outside. The house was neatly decorated, with a clean table in the center and a tiny little kitchen just off the side. As Aerith called, a fairly elderly woman called Elmira walked out of the kitchen and into the living room. Her face was slightly old but very content, and also very pleased to see Aerith back. As she entered, Aerith turned to Cloud and presented him to her.
"This is Cloud," she said. "My bodyguard."
"Bodyguard?
You mean you were followed again?"
Elmira asked, looking at Cloud. She suddenly jumped and walked to Aerith in a hurry, checking her all over.
"Are you all right? You're not hurt, are you?" "I'm all right,"
Aerith insisted as Elmira checked her over for any physical damage.
"I had Cloud with me."
This seemed to reassure Elmira. She looked at Cloud again, this time looking more closely at his face. She stared passively for a minute, before her grave expression turned to a smile as she gently bowed to Cloud in thanks.
Thank you, Cloud.
Then Elmira turned and headed up the stairs towards the upper part of the house, leaving Aerith and Cloud alone in the living room. When she was gone, Aerith turned to Cloud curiously.
So what are you going to do now?
She asked him. Cloud folded his arms for a moment, unsure of what he was going to do. So much had already happened since he crashed through the roof of the church, and he had almost forgotten about it. He suddenly remembered Tifa and Barrett, and wondered if they had managed to get out of the reactor before it blew up on them. And if they did survive, they would surely be out of their minds with worry, wondering if he had survived his fall. Tifa would be much more worried than Barrett, he figured.
Is Sector 7 far from here?
Cloud asked of Aerith as he remembered Tifa.
I want to get to Tifa's bar.
Aerith raised an eyebrow at Cloud.
Is Tifa a girl?
Yeah, said Cloud, nodding his head.
A girl? Friend?
Cloud stared.
Girlfriend?
He asked. He shook his head vigorously.
No way.
Aerith smiled with something that looked like relief, and even laughed a little at Cloud's reaction.
He.
She laughed.
You don't have to get that upset.
She stopped laughing as she winked at Cloud.
Well, that's nice. Let's see, Sector 7? I'll show you the way. You gotta be kidding,
Cloud said in utter disbelief. They had barely managed to get to Sector 5 in one piece, and now Aerith was offering to go out into the dangerous slums again.
Why do you want to put yourself in danger again?
Aerith winked again.
I'm used to it,
she replied.
Used to it?
Cloud demanded, now completely shocked. He took a breath and folded his arms, thinking about it.
Well, don't know. Getting help from a girl.
Immediately, Aerith's eyes flared as she glowered at him.
A girl?
She raged at him furiously.
What do you mean by that? You expect me to just sit by and listen, after hearing you say that?
She turned to the stairs and called up to Elmira.
Mom. I'm taking Cloud to Sector 7. I'll be back in a while.
As she spoke, Elmira began to walk down the stairs. Upon hearing Aerith's words, she looked up in alarm, concerned for Aerith's safety.
But dear,
she protested. She then realized her protest was futile, and so she sighed.
I give up. You never listen once you've made up your mind. But if you must go, why don't you go tomorrow? It's getting late now.
Aerith nodded.
Yeah, you're right, Mom.
Elmira almost sighed with relief.
Aerith, please go and make the bed.
Aerith nodded and quickly headed upstairs to make up a spare bed for Cloud to stay on. Cloud watched her go, feeling a little like an outsider in this happy family household. When he looked back down, he noticed Elmira looking directly at his eyes with a rather grave and serious expression, and Cloud felt uncomfortable.
That glow in your eyes,
she whispered, staring at him.
You're from Soldier, right?
Yeah, replied Cloud.
Rather I used to be.
The old woman in front of him closed her eyes heavily and swallowed hard. Somehow this revelation seemed to strike a nerve within her, and when she reopened her eyes and looked at Cloud, she looked very regretful, but firm.
I don't know how to say this, but...
She began nervously, unsure of how to say it.
Would you please leave here, tonight? Without telling Aerith.
Cloud stared blankly for a few seconds, and Elmira looked down at the ground.
Soldier. The last thing Aerith needs is to get her feelings hurt again.
Cloud stared for a few more seconds, before he finally nodded his head. Elmira was instantly relieved, and gave Cloud a brief, apologetic smile, before she turned and quickly headed into the kitchen to carry on with her work. Cloud, on the other hand, went slowly up the stairs after Aerith. She was just coming out of the spare room as Cloud walked up the stairs. Cloud hesitated for a few seconds as he saw her, unsure of what to say. Something about the way Elmira had asked him to leave gave him the impression that Aerith had run into Soldier before, although he knew it was none of his business to ask what. But when he saw Aerith look down at him and smile, he immediately began to feel the painful feelings of regret for what he knew he had to do.
You need to go through Sector 6 to get to Sector 7,
Aerith said to him as he walked up.
Sector 6 is a little dangerous, so you would better get some rest tonight.
Slowly Cloud nodded, and began to walk somberly into his room. He tried not to glance at Aerith's happy face as he walked past her, and fought the urge to turn around and look at her.
Cloud.
Cloud stopped in his tracks, clenching his fists to fight the urge to turn to her. Instead, he lifted his head up and tilted his head only slightly, just to give the impression that he was listening.
Good night,
Aerith said quietly, and began to walk down the stairs. As she was heading down the stairs, Cloud slowly turned and spotted her as she was walking. Seeing her gentle face made him immediately wish he had not turned around at all, or at least not to even enter her house. He felt like an outsider in a strange world that only Aerith and her mother belonged, and it seemed a painful thing to do what Elmira wanted him to do.
Oh, man.
He groaned. End of chapter.